Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Starr, you talked about the camp counselors and yoga instructors, temporarily employed packers at Amazon being subject to an 18-month non-compete agreement. Professor Paul, have courts ruled on the legality of an 18-month non-compete clause applicable to jobs such as those that I just mentioned?
Please put your microphone on.
Sorry, I keep doing that. So currently, without the intervention of antitrust law, state law as to non-compete agreement varies state by state. So as was discussed, in some states take a very ban non-compete agreements entirely. Most other states use what's called a reasonableness test, and they look at whether, first, the purpose of the non-compete agreement is a legitimate one, and then whether usually the geographical and the temporal duration of the non-compete agreement is reasonable given that objective. So it would be context dependent on the facts of that case, that sector, that particular labor market, and the text of the agreement. In my opinion, under that reasonableness test, none of those should be reasonable. But
Courts have been finding, however, that these types of clauses affecting those kinds of occupations that don't involve trade secrets or proprietary information, state courts have been ruling in favor of these non-compete clauses. Is that correct?
There are a variety of decisions going both ways. I think there are, unfortunately, too many decisions that uphold such non-compete agreements.
Dr. Topol, do you see a problem? I know your testimony is pretty much limited to poaching agreements, and those pretty much apply to high-end, high-tech employment. But I'm speaking of just regular, average workers out here who don't have access to trade secrets or proprietary information. Do you believe that these types of non-compete agreements should be enforced against those workers by state courts? Or do you think that perhaps a federal remedy may be necessary?
I believe that the remedies are in hand in the nature of current antitrust law, and that these should be judged on a case-by-case basis because in many situations the practice itself has a pro-competitive justification.
Well, cite me some of those justifications that could exist for these types of positions that we just talked about: camp counselors, yoga instructors, packers temporarily employed at Amazon. What could be a justification for a non-compete agreement in those fields?
Let me come back to what I said. In my testimony about non-poach agreements, here for no poach agreements.
I'm talking about non-compete agreements here.
I understand. I was about to finish my sentence by saying, in the context of non-competes, similar forces matter, because after all,
cite me some of those factors.
That's what I'm getting at, too, sir. In these contexts, employers invest heavily in locating talented people. Talented people are not easy to come by, and you invest in finding them, recruiting them, training them. And it's reasonable to expect that people would want to get the returns on those investments. Having said that, it depends on the context whether...
Well, let me stop you right there and ask Dr. Starr, what do you think about that response?
I think that Dr. Topel makes a good point that the courts have made for years, actually, but I think that the evidence doesn't quite support that position.
Dr. Marinescu, what is your response?
I agree with Dr. Starr that the evidence doesn't seem to support that position.
Dr. Topel,
Yes.
do you disagree with those two responses?
Remember that both of those responses are making a sweeping statement. And as I said, it depends on the context, which is why I think it should be judged on a case-by-case basis. We can't establish here that a business practice that's so broad, that has existed for so long, even for firms that don't have substantive monopsony power, is uniformly anti-competitive or should be subject to a uniform prohibition. That's why I think it should be judged under the usual methods for Section 2 violations.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms.